The ocean is a vast and mysterious place where for centuries people have been drawn to. And with so much life and wonder just underneath the water's surface, it's easy to see how people can become enamored with the ocean and everything it has to offer. However, the ocean also holds dangers, which, if caught by them, are likely to leave a person scarred for life, if not worse, which is exactly what happened to the man in this story. The Farallon Islands are a group of islands and sea stacks in the Gulf of the Farallones, off the coast of San Francisco, California. Also referred to as the Devil's Teeth Islands by mariners, these islands are home to many treacherous underwater shoals. The islands lie 30 miles outside the Golden Gate, which is a strait on the west coast of North America that connects San Francisco Bay to the Pacific Ocean. And on a clear day, they are visible from the mainland. This is as close to the islands that people are able to get, as they are a designated national wildlife refuge, meaning that they are closed to the public. The only ones who are allowed on the islands are researchers and scientists who study the ecosystems and wildlife that inhabit them. The islands were given their protective status in 1974. Additionally, waters surrounding the islands are also protected as part of the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. However, these islands and the waters surrounding them weren't always under government care. Before the protection status was introduced, people were able to venture onto the islands and swim in the waters nearby. Whilst who was allowed on the islands might have changed over the decades, the types of animals which frequented the sea around them have remained largely the same. For decades, the islands have been home to animals such as seals, sea lions, and a variety of different fish. This makes it a prime location for predators such as the great white shark to hunt in, as there is plenty of food for them to catch. In 2021, an exhaustive new study concluded that there were nearly 300 adult and subadult great white sharks living between Monterey Bay, the Farallon Islands, and Bodega Bay, an area sometimes called the Red Triangle. Subadult sharks are not fully mature, but still big enough to eat seals, sea lions, and other marine mammals. It is difficult to know how many great whites were around the islands at the time of this story, which took place in the 1960s. However, it is safe to assume that there were still quite a few, which could pose as a danger to anyone swimming nearby. Unfortunately for one man, he discovered just how dangerous it was the hard way. Leroy French had lived in San Francisco his whole life. Throughout his childhood, the one thing that he had always enjoyed the most was being out in the ocean. Whether it was swimming in the water or fishing with his dad on a boat, there was something about the beautiful blue water which captivated Leroy. As he got older, he decided to take scuba diving lessons so that he could become a fully qualified diver. Whilst doing these lessons, he became friends with a man called Al Giddings. Together, the two opened up their very own scuba shop, where they also offered lessons and day excursions into the ocean. One day, in 1962, 24-year-old Leroy and Al agreed to lead a group of 30 members of the Mighty Skin Divers Club on a one-day spearfishing excursion. It would be good money to take that many people out, and it would hopefully be a fun and memorable day. However, it turned out to be memorable for all of the wrong reasons. To begin with, Al and Leroy went through all of the safety rules with the group and made sure everyone knew how the equipment worked. Once this was done, the two men took their boat and the group of 30 out to sea. The area where they were diving was quite close to the middle Farallon Island. Looking forward to spending some time in the area, Leroy got suited up. He wore a black wetsuit, swim fins, a weighted belt, and a mask. He also had triple scuba tanks painted yellow, an orange flotation vest, his camera, and spear gun. Ready to dive, Leroy and the rest of the group entered the water at around 11:30 a.m. Leroy spent roughly an hour diving into the water and taking as many photographs of marine wildlife as he could. When he surfaced from his last dive, he found himself roughly 25 meters down current from another diver who had speared a fish that was oozing plenty of blood. Not thinking much of it, Leroy began making his way back to the boat when, out of nowhere, a shark darted towards him. The great white acted quickly and clamped down on Leroy's left forearm with its razor-sharp teeth. With a mouth made up of 7 rows of serrated 2.5-inch long teeth, Leroy was lucky not to lose his arms straight away. Not wanting to let its prey get away, the shark began shaking Leroy violently from side to side. The animal was aiming to separate the man's arm from his body. Despite the agony that he was in, Leroy was able to stay conscious long enough for the shark to let his arm go. Seeing an opportunity, the 24-year-old tried to find some way to make it back to the boat alive. However, the great white wasn't finished with him yet. After letting his arm go, the shark circled Leroy before once again attacking him. This time it bit down on Leroy's right buttock, making it impossible for him to try and swim away or kick out. Whilst this was happening, several of the divers who Leroy had taken out that day noticed what was going on. One of these divers was Leroy's friend and business partner, Al Giddings. Having seen the shark's tail slapping the surface of the water, Al knew that Leroy was in trouble. Wanting to help his friend out, Al began swimming towards Leroy and the shark. Meanwhile, the shark was still attempting to make a meal out of Leroy. Seeing that its attack on Leroy's right buttock wasn't dealing enough damage to its prey, the shark let him go only to clamp down on his left thigh. This time, with the appendage in its grasp, the shark began to pull Leroy under the water. The animal got roughly 5 meters down, all the while twisting and biting down on Leroy's leg with a bite force of almost 4,000 psi. Full of adrenaline, Leroy wasn't giving up quite so easily. The 24-year-old knew that he only had one chance to save himself. So with this in mind, he took his spear gun, which he had managed to hold onto throughout the entire attack, and began jabbing at the shark's face. After 4 or 5 times of doing this, the great white let Leroy's leg go and swam away. By this time, Al had made it to the spot where he had last seen Leroy before he had been pulled underwater. Fearing the worst, Al was relieved when Leroy popped up to the surface in his inflated life vest, very much alive. Not wasting any time, Al grabbed a hold of Leroy and began pulling him back to the boat. He knew that he needed to act fast in case the shark returned and attacked them again. Thankfully, the two were able to make it back to the boat without any further incidents. Once aboard, Al quickly got to work trying to stop Leroy from bleeding out. The 24-year-old's wounds were severe, and if Al didn't stop the bleeding quickly, it was likely that his friend wouldn't survive. As fast as he could, Al took Leroy's wetsuit off and fashioned a temporary tourniquet from some rope which was lying around. It wasn't long after doing this that emergency services arrived to take Leroy to the hospital. Thankfully, someone had had the forethought to call them whilst the attack was underway. This saved precious time and potentially Leroy's life. The U.S. Coast Guard helicopter transported the injured diver to Harbor Emergency Hospital in San Francisco. When he arrived, Leroy was said to be in a state of shock. This was expected, as his adrenaline had worn off, and the reality of what had happened to him had started to sink in. It took a year of hospital trips and staying out of the water, but Leroy eventually made a full recovery. Not one to let his attack scare him away from the ocean, Leroy went on to own a dive tour operation in St. Martin in the 1980s. He also became an award-winning freelance underwater photographer and videographer. His rescuer and friend, Al Giddings, also achieved fame as an underwater photographer. He also went on to become the lead cinematographer on some of the James Bond movies. Whilst the attack on Leroy was horrific, he was lucky that he had the courage to fight for his life along with the help of his friend to get him to safety. After the attack, experts believe that the shark had not attacked Leroy purposefully. Instead, it was likely that the great white had thought that Leroy was a seal due to the gray wetsuit and swimming fins. Since then, though, swimming in the sea around the Farallon Islands has become very restricted, and it's probably for the best. Being a hunting and breeding ground for great whites, it probably isn't somewhere many of us would want to swim. What happened to Leroy can happen to anyone swimming in the ocean, and it can easily result in us meeting our terrifying final affliction.